I'm John Geesman. I'm an attorney representing the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility. I commend you for holding this hearing. It's a long overdue follow-up to your 2008 recommendation that California needs a Plan B in case we experience extended outages at state's nuclear power plants. Looking at you this afternoon, I realize none of you were in your current positions in 2008. And I do know from personal experience there's something about the inertia and amnesia that institutionally affects state government that makes those recommendations oftentimes go into the memory hole. I thank the Energy Commission in its adoption of the 2011 IPER for repeating that 2008 recommendation because nothing had been done between 2008 and 2011. I note that one of your vacancies on the commission has been filled since your adoption hearing, but let me repeat what I said then. My client looks forward to the day when the governor and the Senate Rules Committee considers the work of the Energy Commission of sufficient importance that it is never allowed to have a position vacant longer than the 30 days originally envisioned by Assemblyman Warren and Senator Alquist. I have three major points to address the challenge of planning for the contingency of extended outages at the state's nuclear power plants. The first is we need to recognize the remarkable similarity of our system of utility governance to that in Japan. In Japan, they refer to it as the umakidari system. Here, in a more vulgar way, we'd call it a revolving door. I say that more as an anthropologist than as a muckraker. It's often reported the president of the Public Utilities Commission is a former president of Southern California Edison. You don't read it as often, but the general counsel of the Public Utilities Commission is a former PG&E attorney. The board chair of the ISO is a former president of Southern California Edison. One of the ISO's 5 board members, Southern California Edison's former pollster. The president of San Diego Gas and Electric is a former Public Utilities Commissioner. The governor's chief of staff, former PG&E executive. One of the Energy Commission's most accomplished chairs was a former PG&E executive, and she was the chair when you originally made that 2008 recommendation about the need to plan for extended outages at the state's nuclear power plants. The most prominent example of our umakidari system, the former CEO of Edison International, was a former president of the Public Utilities Commission. My second point is that this system of government imposes extraordinary requirements of transparency and an exaggerated requirement to challenge each and every underlying assumption in our planning process, and frankly, a high level of candor about the uncertainty that that analysis invariably faces. And to be honest, given human nature, we don't always live up to that. Somehow, we have adopted the assumption that songs in Diablo will run 24/7 indefinitely, and that it is within our institutional discretion to determine whether they do or not. I don't think, if you look at the experience of nuclear power plants in this country or around the world, barring Shoreham or Rancho Seco, the failure mode is seldom a discretionary choice. Our once-through cooling policy assumes both plants operate 24/7. Our AB 1318 analysis assumes both plants operate 24/7. Even our AB 32 scoping plan assumes both plants operate 24/7. The peril of this kind of intellectual blind spot only becomes apparent when things go wrong. After 15 years of capital investment decisions being made by a so-called independent grid manager, and I'm sorry Mr. Berberich is not here to hear this, but after 15 years of having decisions as to how to expand the grid, where to expand the grid, how much money to spend on expanding the grid, how could an entire region of our state become dependent upon the operation of a single 2,250 megawatt power plant? How can that happen? My third point, never forget the second rule of holes. Everybody knows about the first rule, you stop digging when you find yourself in a hole. But the second rule is you build yourself a ladder. And I emphasize the word build, and I suspect Mr. Burbrick would have appreciated that. There's a reason that 5-6 years ago, the federal government declared the entire 7 southernmost counties in California a transmission corridor of national significance. The California Energy Commission was the only state agency in the United States to endorse that federalization of transmission siting jurisdiction, because our system inside California was so dysfunctional. The NERC-FERC report on last year's San Diego blackout describes what's known in the professional trade as a cluster function. Frankly, I think it would be quite a bit wiser if that had addressed some of our hardware problems as well. You need to have automated responses to these contingencies that do come up. And I commend my friend Jim Avery and his company for their perseverance for seeing through the Sunrise power line. But I believe their job is only half done. They have yet to address improving the north-south linkage between the Edison system and their system. And I think that some of you, such as Commissioner Florio, can remember 10 years ago when the ISO recommended on its own initiative that strengthening take place. San Diego pursued a project known as Valley Rainbow. PUC failed to approve it, but on a 3-2 vote. To my surprise, that question has never been revisited. I think the San Diego blackout should have caused a revisiting. If you will remember, the administrative law judge in that proceeding framed the issue in a classic California way. He said, the proponents of the transmission line argue in favor of a 10-year planning horizon, because they say that if you restrict your analysis to 5 years, no project will ever be found needed. The opponents of the project insist that you need to have a 5-year planning horizon, because if you extend it to 10 years, no project would never be found unneeded. So we, in our ignorance, proceeded down a path where we thought arrogantly enough we could manage a just-in-time infrastructure policy. And I remind you, this analysis was done in 2003. It doesn't matter if you use the 5-year or the 10-year planning horizon. We're in the soup now. And I would suggest to you a proper evaluation of our grid requirements would greatly lessen our perception right now of the indispensability of San Onofre to Southern California. I'm still a believer in the Energy Action Plan and the loading order, which has been the cornerstone of the state's energy policy for more than 10 years. Uncommitted efficiency, as Mr. Jaski and Mr. Vitterver characterize it on their slides, demand response, distributed generation. Those have been slogans for the last decade. I would suggest to you, going forward in this IPER update, it's time to put up or shut up. There's been too much easy talk, too much sloganeering, too much feel-good policy, not enough delivery. And I mean delivery in terms of measurement of energy and capacity, which the ISO feels in its management of the grid it can rely upon. Ted Craver, the CEO of Southern California, or Edison International, told the LA Times a couple of weeks ago that the decision to reopen San Onofre would probably be the biggest decision he makes as CEO. Frankly, there's probably a little bit of Freudian slippage in Ted's remarks. Everybody in the room knows that the decision to reopen will not be Ted's alone. What I think he meant to say was the decision whether or not to reopen. And he's likely to have an outsized influence on at least the negative side of that question. But as we go forward, this commission, Public Utilities Commission, California ISO, needs to come to grips with the fact that these plants may not be available indefinitely, and they may be gone for extended periods of time. The people of California look to you to plan for that contingency. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
Thank you. As a former energy commissioner yourself, I appreciate you keeping some of our institutional memory alive.